I know people talk that AI is going to get rid of developers, but I think we're just leveling up a new level of tool. My friend Don said this a while back at a talk, and it really resonated with me. He's like, circular saws and nail guns didn't get rid of construction workers. It just made them more efficient, and the problems are different. But there's less of them, perhaps. But they're still doing the same things with just better tools. And I think that's roughly what's happening. At least for the next 5 years, right? I don't see myself not coding in 3 years. I am going to be spending a lot more time talking to Claude, telling it what to build, but I'm still going to have to get in there and code a little bit here and there.
Hello, I'm Adam Haney, and this is the Open Story podcast where I talk with technology leaders, builders, and visionaries about their projects and passions. Today, I'm joined by Frank Wiles, founder of RevSys, early Django contributor, and prolific open source contributor. Frank, thank you so much for taking the time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, man. Well, I mean, you've done a bunch of really interesting things. And so I'm going to get to RevSys, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the mentorship work that you've done and all the different, projects that you've worked on. But I always like to get to start. One of the privileges of getting to interview people is I get to learn about their lives. And I'm always curious, different people that build things, oftentimes they have cool stories about where they started as a kid or the things that they were tinkering with. What's that story like for you? What kind of captured your imagination? How did you get started? What were kind of some of your earliest adventures into technology?
So I've always been interested in just how things work. Favorite TV show of all time is How It's Made, right?
Yeah.
And
Me too,
and so
man.
I'm
I love that.
I'm the nerd that walks into a big box store, and I'm looking up at the ceiling rafters trying to figure out why they're positioned the way they are, even though I'm not a structural engineer or an architect. I'm just why is that beam there? I don't understand. Let me see if I can figure it out. But yeah, no, as a kid, I got enamored with Star Wars, of course, and movies like War Games. And I was just I am interested. There's this box of possibility because, computers were pretty new. I'm fairly old. So there was, one computer in my school in grade school, right? That.
Do you remember what it was?
I do not actually. It had a green screen, but it was probably some, Atari something. And, they wheeled it around on a cart and you got 5 minutes a week with it. And I'm there is this box of possibility. I am interested in how does that work inside? Right. And I've just basically never stopped.
That's awesome. And then, I mean, also you jumped into open source really early too. Is that the same kind of itch to sort of be okay, now I can look up in the ceiling rafters, will actually maybe hopefully have a README or some benevolent open source contributor that'll tell me why things are this way? Or how did you jump in there?
It was a little bit that. It was also a little, screw the man, commercial software's too expensive, right? I worked an entire summer in high school at a crappy steak and salad bar place in my small town, mostly washing dishes. I eventually got promoted up to salad bar to make $800 so that I could, with an educational discount, get the Wacom C++ cross compiler so I could compile on my OS2 system for Windows and DOS and OS2. It was a $2,500 compiler, right?
Wow, it was before GCC and before the new project. Okay.
So 6 months later, I found GCC and I'm crap, there's this stuff for free.
Yeah.
and it's about as good. And then I was hooked. Right. And then it was, what can I do? More and more open source. And the internet ran on Unix and Linux, right, primarily. And so it was okay, this is where I want to be. And so I had, an early career of sysadmining commercial Unix and quickly realized that Linux and FreeBSD, I was a FreeBSD guy for, I don't know, at least 5 or 6 years. And it was so much nicer to work with. It was so much easier to find the answer, fix the problem, and it was $2,000 a year for your operating system license. So it was easy to sell to the business I was working in, right? It's hey, I don't have to buy Microsoft Exchange for 10,000 people. I need a 486 with Linux and we can run SendMail.
Yeah. Do you remember what the first open source project, I mean, was it GCC or were there what did you kind of first, dip your toe into the water and start working on?
So GCC was the first one that kind of made me realize, oh, wow, this is this exists. Like I didn't know open source really existed before I found things like GCC. But yeah, the first one I really contributed to was the Mod Perl project. I had gotten into Perl. As mostly because I was building web things and it was the way you built web things back in the 90s and early 2000s. And so Mod Perl was how you ran web things at scale with speed and performance. And that's always been kind of one of those things that I happened to get good at, mostly because I was forced to, right? I had a fixed yearly budget and a growing user base, and I was not allowed to buy computers. Basically,
Yeah.
there was no cloud. You couldn't just scale.
Efficiency just is like not an option, right? Like you're, especially back then when like hardware, I mean, it's wild to think about how much faster like memory, storage, compute, everything in my lifetime, like what that has sort of changed. People, I don't know, this is going to turn into like a kids these days
Yeah.
kind of
Get
like
off my
conversation,
lawn.
but
Yeah.
get off my lawn. But like, I mean, I think that people that grew up in that era like have a much deeper understanding and appreciation of how operating systems work, like the sort of fundamentals of what the machine is doing, as opposed to just sort of like npm install and then it just hums and gets really hot, and then all of a sudden a website gets spit out the other side.
Yeah, like, and if people are interested in that sort of stuff, like a good book to check out is, it's called The Lion's Book. On it's a early basically narration of the original Unix kernel. And so like stuff will blow your mind, like kill dash nine. Nine is just the integer nine in an enum.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing more special about that. It just happened to be the ninth one, and that's why sig kill was dash nine. And that stuff I just find fascinating. That it's turtles all the way down. It's layers of the onion of abstraction on abstraction on abstraction on abstraction down to ones and zeros, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I remember in an operating system class in undergrad, we had to implement malloc, and I still feel like
Mhm.
that the process of being told like you're going to have to go implement an allocator for memory in C, like 90% of my systems knowledge just came from bashing my head into the desk of a computer lab during undergrad. Well, that same kind of era when you were toying with BSD and sort of like getting into Perl, like you had an ISP, is that right? Like what was that like process like? Like what caused that to happen?
So I live in Lawrence, Kansas. Is a small little hippie college town in Kansas. We're the one blue county in an otherwise red state. To give us some street cred, like William S. Burroughs retired here. That's kind of how hippie and progressive of a town this is. And there's a coffee shop. It used to be 24 hours. That's just a couple blocks that way. And I used to hang out there. And there was a long-haired guy who would come in and chain smoke, and he always had an O'Reilly book with him. And I eventually got to know him, and he was the sysadmin of the local cable ISP. Lawrence was the second city in the US to have cable modems. So like I was one of the first beta testers for the DOCSIS standard. I was probably like modem number 7, something like that in the
That's
world to
cool.
use DOCSIS, like actually in the field and not in a lab. And so I, became friends with this guy, and they eventually let him get an assistant. And so I was still in college, and I'm like, I am nowhere near qualified for this job. Like, this is hardcore sysadmining for real things and real people. And he's like, oh, I know you're not qualified, but you got the right brain for it, and you seem like you'll be a good worker and easy to work with and everything. And so yeah, so we ran a cable ISP before anybody knew how to do that, and it was like a couple of SGI IRIX boxes and a couple of FreeBSD like sixes, eventually moving all to Linux over the years. But yeah, at the height, we were supporting 35,000 uh, cable modems in 4 cities here in eastern Kansas, and having to do that with constrained budgets and you
Yeah.
know the growing feeling that the internet is a must be on 24/7 commodity, which is where something dropped what you were doing and maybe ran through a red light to get to the head end so that you could reboot the server or figure out what it was. A lot of 2 a.m. maintenance. Luckily I was in my 20s, and luckily that
Yeah.
coffee shop was right across the street. It was 24 hours, so that I spent a lot of time there and still do. Funnily enough, many years later, about 8 years ago, I ended up hiring him, and now he's my main ops guy.
Oh,
That's
nice.
they basically taught me ops way back then.
And it's been a little while since I've thought about ISPs in that kind of capacity. What is the high level system architecture of what you were doing? So I mean, like that's the days of like 56K modems. Like were you like coloed in some sort of like telecom facility, or like what's
No, so
actually
yeah,
what's the
yeah.
ISP doing in order to like connect from the early days of the internet to the sort of main network? Like this is kind of honestly like I've never had to set up BGP or anything like that myself. I'm kind of curious, like what was it then, and kind of how has it evolved?
So there was an existing cable operation, so cable TV. And so they had a what they call a head end, which we would think of as a data center. And there was, satellite dishes bringing in television signals and then pushed out over the cable, either to just what they call like standard def TV, or to digital boxes, so that you could do high def and things like that. Cable modems took advantage of what they called the roll off in the signal, where we could not take over a TV channel, but there was like a half a channel on each end, and you could do up and
Okay.
down
This is like
with
open spectrum, basically.
open spectrum there that wasn't in use. And that's where cable modems operated primarily for the first few years. Now they can kind of be wherever in the spectrum, but it works the same as a phone modem, right? Like as a 56K modem, right? It's just changing it to radio frequency instead of sound. Operates on all the same basic principles. But there's some quality of the service, and you can set people's speeds, and there's some different stuff there in the DOCSIS spec. Effectively, the modem wakes up and broadcasts out and says, "Hey, where is my CMTS cable modem termination system?" And it replies back and says, "I'm right here. I
Mhm.
recognize you. You're supposed to have, you know." 25 meg down and 2 meg up, or whatever you're paying for, and it configures itself that way, and starts to operate. But so we had, those CMTSs are effectively routers, the routers and switches, but instead of it being Ethernet on one side, it's coax, right? And then, we would provide DNS. So we had primary and secondary DNS for everybody to use, and also hosted, business domains and things in town. Email was one of the larger services, because at the time, POP was the standard protocol, and IMAP, and people would leave their mail on the server, and people would not clean up their
Yeah.
mail. And so, like, it became a storage problem, and especially when you can't just infinitely grow storage. I mean, to give people context, if I convinced management to let me buy a server, the fastest I could get it in a rack was probably about 5 weeks, right? And, now you can just spin up capacity,
Yeah.
and it's just an entirely different world, and it's much nicer, right? Like I there's some nostalgia for climbing behind a rack and tracing a cable, but for the most part, I prefer the cloud.
I totally agree. My first CTO gig was the only time that I actually had racked servers, and I'll never forget. We had an outage, and we like went to the data center to go, and like burned in my memory is just how cold and loud data centers are when you have to spend any significant amount of time there. And so I'm very happy for things to live up in the cloud, and I can be climate controlled in whatever way is comfortable for
Yeah,
me.
absolutely.
Well, I won't give away the punchline here as it relates to Django, because I think like also it might have had something to do with the coffee shop you were talking about earlier. But like, how did you kind of get involved? I know you served as the president of the Django Software Foundation. You're on the steering committee now. Like you've been a prolific contributor to that project. Django's been a huge part of my career. Like every startup that I've worked on has had Django kind of has been a part of the infrastructure at some point, including when I worked at Meta and worked on Django as a part of Instagram. So huge, kind of world changing project. How did you first get involved with that, and when did you first get involved with that, and maybe a little bit of history there?
Yeah, sure. So, same company that had the forethought to do cable modems early had built their own. They were one of the first newspapers online. They were like one of the first 100 newspapers to be online, and we had built a content management system in Perl. And through various reorganizations and things, all of the developers that worked in that department had left, and they hired a new head of that department, and he brought in Adrian Holovati, who didn't really want to work in Perl. He had been mostly doing PHP, and Adrian convinced Simon Willison to join. And Simon came over on a 1-year student visa here to Lawrence, and they decided they wanted to build their new website stuff in Python. They both were kind of into Python. They thought it was a better path than PHP. And so they just started building a website. And it ended up being Lawrence.com, which is still alive kind of these days. It was an amazing entertainment, local news and entertainment site. Back then, that's where I would go to see like what's happening on Friday night, right? It had the calendar of everything happening and that was cool in town. They started replacing all of the various websites the company owned with this. They called it the CMS at that point. And they realized right around that same time, Rails got extracted out of Basecamp and was open sourced. And they realized they were onto something. And my first and for the first probably 5 years of its life and major contribution to Django was they asked me to come and argue to open source Django to the owners of the company because I had a good relationship with them and I spoke suit and lawyer. And so I showed up to the meeting mostly as a favor to them, and it's like, hey, there's nothing that can happen bad to the company. Like this is how open source works. You're either going to knock it out of the park or it's going to be a nothing burger, and it doesn't matter to the company whatsoever. And you can still sell your commercial content management system if you want, and hopefully this takes off and you get free code and free bug
Yeah.
fixes, and it helps with hiring, and people can show up day one knowing what you work with, and that all resonated with them. And so we open sourced Django, and it wasn't until several years later that I actually really ended up using it. But it was really just kind of partly right place at right time. But that company, I was effectively like an internal consultant for several years, where it's like I'm dealing with satellite issues, I'm dealing with 911 and telephone service, like real telephone service, counting problems in the newspaper department, and why the classifieds didn't print correctly, and cable ISP issues. It was kind of all over the place, and so that's why I never left. I never ended up going to the
Yeah.
Bay Area or New York or something, because it was an interesting enough situation, and I could stay close to my family and not have coastal living prices.
Right. Well, I mean, I feel like so many people, like they go to the Bay Area or they go to New York to like find something really cool to work on, or to find like, their tribe or their like smart people. And it sounds like you already had found it. So like, why leave?
Yep.
So that makes a ton of sense. Well, I mean, Django has been, such a widely adopted project. I mean, like I think obviously that like initial decision, going to this company and saying you should open source this. I mean, was the birth of it in a very real way, or at least the reason that we're able to use it is because you convinced them. Are there other parts of the Django history that you think have been important, whether that's technical architecture or governance or the way that people found out about Django? Like, what do you think it is that has led to the adoption and then now the resiliency? I mean, when I think back, like there are tons of open source projects that were around that were super popular. Like jQuery comes to mind, or like the really a large part of the PHP and Perl community. Nobody uses those tools anymore. We evolved, but somehow Django has been able to kind of surf that wave. Like it's gotten better year on year. Is that because of the people? Is that because of the architecture? Or are there like times in its history that you think, hey, Django could have died here, but it lived because thing?
So I actually gave a talk on this kind of subject at the last Django Con. We should link to it, but it's the early history. But
Yeah.
the highlights there are it's mostly the people, right? The original kind of core team are awesome technologists, but first, they're awesomely nice people. They're just good people. And they don't put up with assholes, and they kicked anybody out of the community who was being an asshole. That was a big part. It was very welcoming, and yes, please come contribute, help, thank you, like that stuff goes a long way and people overlook it sometimes. I think the couple of key non really technical decisions, or not really hardcore technical decisions, but the Django admin was a big leverage point, that you could build an app and you didn't have to build an admin interface, right? At least day one, right? So that was a win for Django, and efficiency across the board. Django has always had a focus on good documentation, which is another spot where I see a lot of open source. There are so many projects I try out. I'm like, this looks really cool, but I'm getting this error, and 45 minutes later, and I can't solve it. And so I move on. And maybe I come back in 6 months and try it again, but more than likely I've forgotten about it. And so the fact that there was amazing docs from day one, and a little bit of a focus on design. We had design people kind of in the team the first several years that would make sure the docs looked good, that the admin looked good, that, there was some thought behind the user experience there, and it wasn't all designed by programmer, right? And those things I think contributed a lot to that kind of out of the box experience people have with Django. And they're like, oh, wow, like this is so much nicer than the last thing I used. And I got more done in less time, To your point about inflection points where it may have died, there's definitely a couple as the original core team started to get busy. So like, you'd mentioned Instagram, like Carl Meyer, one of the main contributors for many years, he got a job there and got busy and couldn't contribute to Django as much, right? And other people have moved on in their careers and family lives and things, and they can't contribute as much. We didn't do a great job of bringing up that next class of contributor. And so the fact that the Django Software Foundation started having the Django Fellows, which are paid contractors who work on Django, is what's kept Django alive these last 10 years.
How is that funded? Like, I'd love to better understand,
Yeah.
because there's sort of a philanthropic element to the foundation. Like, what's the structure there?
So yeah, the Django Software Foundation is a typical 501c3, a nonprofit. They get contributions from individuals and companies like RevSys. Instagram gave money, years ago. Mozilla's given money. Various companies do. If your company uses Django, I highly encourage you to convince your boss to give a few $1,000s to Django. If you want Django to survive, it really does need to happen. And so that money is used to pay for the fellows, any sort of legal needs around, maintaining the trademark and things like that. And then also to support Django related events around the world. So a lot of the budget goes to things like Django Girls events in Africa and, Django events in Southeast Asia and places that don't get, they don't have an AI startup that's going to buy the pizza and beer at the meetup because, they're in Ghana, not San Francisco. And so, but the bulk of the funds go to paying the fellows. And so right now there is a full-time and a half-time fellow, and they help shepherd the tickets, help make sure that, security reports are dealt with quickly. They handle all the releases and the release process and make sure that's all going well and ensuring backwards compatibility so that every time we release, we don't break a bunch of people's stuff. They're absolutely, it's the grunt. Well, I don't want to say grunt work in that it's not important, but it's the most important work that is probably the least personally satisfying to your average developer. It's not the cool stuff, right?
Yeah,
It's
but
the
it's
data.
necessary. Yeah,
Yep.
that makes complete sense. Well, I've read bits and pieces of that, but I didn't really have an appreciation for all of the things that the fellows and the Django Software Foundation in general kind of do to keep the lights on for like one of the most important open source projects in the world. So that's super cool. I want to shift gears a little bit, maybe, and you've mentioned RevSys, which I know is your day job. Like, what's kind of a high level overview of what RevSys does, and what does your all's work there look like?
So RevSys started me doing Perl and Postgres consulting actually way back, and then I ended up sharing an office with Jacob Kaplan Moss, who was one of the creators of Django. Ended up learning Django at many years after that meeting, and realizing it was way better than the Perl tools I was using. So we switched, and he joined, and we decided to just focus entirely on Django. Over the years, that's expanded a bit to being Python in general, right? And then also just kind of web at scale. There's a lot of kind of, techniques that work no matter what framework you're using, that especially startups and people who haven't run something large just don't know how to do, don't realize, they don't know what they don't know, around caching and things like that, right? That often, me spending a day with, a lead dev can unlock 4x performance just because they didn't know what to be looking for, right? Yeah, most of our work is usually Django based. We're doing a lot more things with AI, obviously these days, and specifically Pydantic AI is kind of our framework of choice for building agents and tools. But we do a lot. We were early adopters of Kubernetes, and so we do a lot of helping companies move to Kubernetes or use Kubernetes more effectively. But yeah, we do, I would say on average, it's more internal apps than external. It's usually some sort of internal workflow solution for, random businesses or science research. We
That's
do
cool.
we do like business simulation software for like the Wharton School, but also like hotel like software for hunting lodges on a company that owns thousands of acres of forests for logging, because no hotel software has options for needs a hunting permit or wants to rent a
Right.
shotgun, like things like that just don't exist, that they need to build their own. But then also, more, there's science oriented projects, weird e-commerce that doesn't fit into a normal e-commerce scenario because, they have 200,000 SKUs and you can't really do that in Shopify.
Yeah. Well, we were talking a little bit before we started recording about how, most people in their career, see 5 or 6 teams in their entire career. You see 5 or 6 teams a quarter and maybe more than that. You were talking a little bit about, like caching or like being able to kind of help. There are multiple different dimensions of the kinds of problems I know that you can help with. Maybe let's start on the technical, in that it's a
Sure.
little bit easier to generalize. And then, people are always messy, but like, what do you see as some of the like most common failure points? Like, are there recurring themes in the places where people don't know what they don't know? I don't want to give away the secret sauce, but like, maybe are.
Honestly, most of our marketing is giving away the secret sauce. So no, people want real time.
Mhm.
And when they think caching, they think customers who are going to view this data won't see an updated copy for 4 hours.
Yeah.
And that's a bad way to think about it because, if you get on the front page of Hacker News and Reddit, let's say, at the same time, a 1 minute cache can save your life, right? And when you go, oh, it's only going to be out of date for a minute or 5 minutes, we can totally do that. But they would never consider it because they figured it wouldn't be effective unless it was 4 hours or 12 hours or something like that. And so realizing that, I mean, there's no real time really in computers anyway. There's near real time, but you know, there's very, very, very few situations on this earth that, milliseconds matter. And if you're not in high frequency stock trading, milliseconds probably don't matter to what you're doing. Hotel booking, if that is probably not the end of the world. Maybe once a year you're going to accidentally double book a room, but you're going to reduce all of the problems you have in terms of scalability by just having a short cache.
Yeah. Well, I'll go maybe a little bit from technical problems to people problems. Like, I mean, I know you and I have worked together. You were super helpful with my team at Invisible, but you really also specialize in helping to make sure that people can increase their team velocity, which a lot of times is going to, delve into, I'm sure, processes and practices for development, overall kind of organizational design, all of those kinds of pieces. Maybe, a layer up from caching, like where do you see leaders kind of fall down in terms of the way that they set up their teams, or other ways that they could improve, or that you would be like, man, everybody would be a little bit better if they all did it this way, or they're kind of common, places where people miss.
I think even technical managers who've done the job discount how impactful meetings are, and not just the number of meetings, but when they're scheduled in the developer's day. I've worked with so many teams that I'm going to, let's say they work an 8 to 5 schedule. They have a 10 a.m. meeting and a 2 p.m. meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't code that day. They tried to code, they started to get there, and then they got to stop for the meeting. And then right as the meeting's over and they just about get up, it's time to go to lunch. And I can't push lunch because if I push lunch, then I don't have time, for that next meeting, right? And then it's the end of the day. And, they were there, they had their editor open, they were staring at stuff, but they really just can't get into flow at all. And so even having a couple of days, move your meetings, pack your meetings onto Tuesdays and Thursdays or Mondays and Fridays or whatever works for your organization. But having a day or two even where there's no meetings, or the meeting is first thing or last thing in their day, which I get with time zones, it becomes a scheduling nightmare. I mean, I have a daily 6:30 a.m. stand up with a team in India because it's the only way it
Yeah.
works, right? Like it's the end of their day and I get up a little early and I'm in it. Yes, I'd prefer that it was at 8 o'clock my time, but then it's 7 o'clock, it's right in their dinner. Like that doesn't make any sense. That can be 10 or 20% to an overall team's velocity. Just that, right? More technical things are, observability, bite around a bug or a problem because they don't realize it's right here, because there isn't any good logging and metrics right there in that black box. And everybody intends to do it, myself included. You tend to do this project, I'm going to have amazing observability, and you have spots where you don't. But leaders often will push that aside for the new feature. And if they would just take a sprint or two to nail
Yeah.
that better, then they probably can double the number of new features they can do in the next couple of sprints. That feedback loop, the tighter your feedback loop can be, local development, problem solving in production, the tighter that feedback loop is probably one of the most important things to solving whatever the problem is, right? And even with people, right? Like, if I'm working with somebody and if they had a way to tell me very blunt feedback very quickly, like right after this podcast, if you're like, oh man, Frank, if you wouldn't have said that, or you should have said this, like if that could happen right then, that would be preferable to me getting an email 3 weeks from now, right? Or waiting for our one-on-one on Friday, right? I mean, like, I'm not saying you need to call people out directly after every meeting, but that same thing applies in people as well as tech. And so anytime I'm struggling to get something done, or I'm struggling to solve a problem, I tend to stop and go, how can I make this feedback loop tighter? How can I get more reps in to solving this? If it's a 20-minute CI build, maybe step one of fixing this problem is spending an hour to make that be 10 minutes. And maybe that solves the current problem faster, but if nothing else, it solves everyone's build time problems for the next quarter, right? Until it creeps back up again, right? But yeah, getting that feedback loop as tight as you possibly can, is one of the keys to getting stuff done.
I notice in that you didn't say like, oh, you should check out Cursor, or like Windsurf is fantastic, or like look at Codex and the way that it's generating, like new code in order to solve. I feel like it's really buzzy right now for people to think that like AI agents that are writing code, maybe that are running tests or that are doing QA on top of that. What's your take on the way that those kinds of tools are going to impact developer productivity? Is it still, the core of this is how well can I take something that I've created and get it into production and then observe how it's behaving in production? Or how do you think about the AI tools in the generation space as they relate to productivity?
I stand by my feedback loop there. So having tests that don't take forever to run, having tests that the LLM can run for you, and something like I tend to use Claude code more than anything these days, or Aider. And having good tests, having those tests be meaningful, I think gets more and more important as we have more and more LLM generated code. I think sketching out the architecture, the data structures prior, don't let the LLM to do that.
Yeah.
Maybe have it take a first pass, but you need to spend an hour and make sure it's right before you generate all the user interface around it, right? That's where we're going to spend a lot of our time. And again, like, the only complaint I have about Claude Code is that it's not fast enough, right? That feedback loop.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm going to go check an email, and next thing I know, I've almost forgotten I'm working on that feature, right? I'm 3 emails in, and I'm dealing with some accounting or something, and so I worry about what happens to flow, um, for the developer when there's 2 minute, 5 minute pauses between things. And, somebody suggested that that's a good time to do push-ups or some body weight exercises or something. And I'm like, that's actually not half bad. Like, we can get in a little bit better shape. And I'm not thinking about something else. I'm there still with the LLM, and I'm probably not thinking about my vacation plans or something, right? I can stay focused on what I'm doing. But yeah, that feedback loop is super important. So like, I'm even doing things like standing up like Victoria logs and Grafana and custom logging tools for my local development, so that I get the right logs in front of my face as I'm debugging the problem, and it's not just something that ops uses when it's deployed.
Yeah. I think that step of data model, and really, I think about there are so many things about defining the actual problem that you're solving. Then, sort of at the edges, if you think about that as being the roots of the tree, are effectively what are my personas, what is the business problem that I'm trying to solve, like what are the rules or policies related to the thing that I'm building, and then what are the data structures. Very easy then for LLMs to go and implement user interfaces or go and implement things at the margin. But if you get that wrong, man, it's like really hard. I mean, now all of a sudden you've just generated a massive volume of code that you need to go refactor, and literally no one in the company knows how it works and didn't, do the critical thinking about how it should work in the first place. And so it makes a ton of sense to say, what are my rules? What are my invariants? How am I going to QA that in the future? How am I going to make sure the feedback loop that this is doing what I expect makes sense? And then from there, use whatever you need to create, whether it's hand coding something or generating it with an agent.
Well, and I think that, you should be able to, I mean, not Facebook maybe, but, your average shop, the product you work on, you should be able to basically keep the data model in your head. You should know
Hmm.
what it is. You should basically know the relationships. You should know how a bill becomes a law, right? Whatever it
Yeah.
is, like inputs come in this side, some things happen. You might not know all the intricate details and business rules of when it shifts from stage one to stage three, but you know that there is a decision making process over here that decides if it moves left or right. And then, emails go out or text messages or files get dropped or whatever happens on the other end of your product. You should be able to keep that in your head, and that should be part of the developer onboarding process. There are so many times I've worked in teams where the developer who's been there for a year doesn't know what comes in and what goes out of their app. They are given a Jira ticket that says, edit this file this way, make this test pass. And they don't even really know what they do, right? Good humans are going to find, hey, this doesn't make any sense. You're asking me to do something that makes no sense. And so we were talking about people and process. I think a lot of companies, and I actually Invisible did this really well with the architecture stand-ups. And I'm going to steal that idea with future customers, because that is the point where somebody's proposing a new big change to the product, that you should have your top 10, 20% of developers, your lead devs, review it quickly, because sometimes you'll find that the way you're building it is going to make it harder to interface with this system, or there's a performance problem with what you're doing, or you don't need it because it already exists over here and we just need to use it, and you just saved 2 sprints of work because you didn't even need to build that feature exists over here, or there's code that you could reuse for that purpose. There's a client that I've been working with for a couple of years. They do this all the time. Somebody spends a week working on an issue that should have never happened. It's, standing up an environment for a product that's getting sunset. And it's like, why are we, going over the security of this staging environment with a fine tooth comb when it's going to get shut off in 2 months, that kind of stuff. And it just happens all the time. The bigger the organization, the more that happens.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that recently you and your team have been doing a lot in Pydantic. Tell me a little bit more about that. What kinds of projects are you working on? What are you excited about? Whether it's the specific implementation or the community, the framework
Yeah.
at a higher level.
Well, so Pydantic, is a great library for doing data validation and serialization and deserialization in Python using Python types. And so we've been using that more and more over the last few years as part of building REST APIs and
Hmm.
other sorts of kind of quick data validation and modeling processes that don't necessarily exist in a database where we would use the Django ORM, right? So when AI started to grow and we realized had customers wanting to use it more in their own products, but also realizing as a company we need to do more of that because that's going to be where a lot of future development needs are. We started looking around at various kind of agent frameworks, and I'm like, okay, trying to pick who's going to win, right? Or at least who's going to win for the next few years, right? And we kind of looked into LangChain, which is one of the more popular ones. And as I dug into the code, I realized that like their abstractions are good, but they're not doing much. And it's like, I
Hmm.
don't know why I would use your framework for these abstractions when I could just build them myself,
Yeah.
and not be tied into this framework, and maybe beating my head against a bug that turns out it's just I don't understand what the framework's trying to do there. And then Pydantic AI came out, and we quickly looked at it, and it's the right level of abstraction for our brains, I guess. And it's super flexible. There's nothing that really gets in your way. It's all kind of just Python and types, and very smartly put together. Um, and it's just tools that I would have expected us to take a week to build. We get built in a day, and it just stays out of the way and does its thing. Your ability to build little tool calls is just add a decorator and you've got a tool. And that's pretty awesome, honestly. It's been so much fun to build little things that I would have never guessed we would be able to build, right?
And I'm reading the docs right now. Like it looks like it also does MCP and agent to agent and all of the other sort of
Yeah.
like underlying protocols for communication as well.
And multi-agent, and you can even have like kind of a graph, like a finite state machine based on types, and so you can have an agent return a certain type, which then ends up calling another agent, depending, like it. You can, I think they say in the documentation that that's a nail gun. Like, don't use a nail gun when you need a hammer, but like if you need a nail gun, here's a nail gun.
Yeah.
It is super powerful. We have not needed that, thankfully, quite yet. Most of our client needs have been pretty modest, but there's been a lot of great tools we've built for ourselves. I've blogged recently about, I talk about the feedback loop a lot. And I call the things that get in the way of that speed bumps. And it's little speed bumps of like 5 minutes for this thing to start. Like, I'll go get a coffee, or let me check my email one more time, and then I'll get, like those little, they're motivational things. Like it's just our human psychology that gets in the way almost more than desire to get it done or work ethic or anything like that. But I've been building little tools with LLMs and agents that just get rid of those speed bumps for me. And the more of those I get rid of, the more I just plow through real work that I want to get done, that's real meaningful work. So, I know people talk that AI is going to get rid of developers, but I think it really is, we're just leveling up a new level of tool. My friend Don said this a while back at a talk, and it really resonated with me. He's like, circular saws and nail guns didn't get rid of construction workers. It just made them more efficient, and the problems are different, but there's less of them perhaps than needed, but they're still doing the same things with just better tools. And I think that's roughly what's happening, at least for the next 5 years, right? I don't see myself not coding, in 3 years. I am going to be spending a lot more time talking to Claude, telling it what to build, but I'm still going to have to get in there and code a little bit here and there, fix a thing here and there. Just this morning, there was a problem that I started to have Claude do it. And I'm like, this is like one CSS class in one file. What am I doing? And I like, why am I going to wait 90 seconds for it to do this when I can probably do it in 15 seconds myself? And I know exactly where it is and I'm like telling it what line, like, what am I doing?
Yeah. I love the circular saw metaphor. I mean, when I think about that as well, like you assume that there are, a fixed number of houses that we're going to build a year, which is not true. Like there's an induced demand, which is if we can change the economics of how we build things, in some cases we actually end up just building more things. So it doesn't necessarily result in a net reduction of the people doing that. It just means that their productivity increases, which I think is an exciting thing as we think about, there are now software tools or services that previously they wouldn't make sense to build custom software for. Like maybe it would have been prohibitively expensive for the hunting community that you guys were building tools to go out and have somebody create that, and now all of a sudden we can have better operating software, as well as like the other thing that I think is going to be interesting. We were talking about kind of the birth of the internet. There's a huge portion of the deployed code in the world that was in that first or second vintage of creation. There's a lot of maintenance, rewrites, improvement that could happen. As there is more software, there will be more maintenance, and so how we kind of handle that problem. I'm curious, what's the UI that you're using whenever you're engaging with these agents? Is all of that going through Cursor, or like what is the sort of local development stack that you're making use of as you're building these tools to reduce the speed bumps in your workflow?
So it's a combination of things that are like CLI tools. I'm not building a lot of GUIs for
Mm-hmm.
myself. I'm an old command line nerd, so I typically have like Vim open in a window and Claude open in a window and a browser, which is, the app,
Mm-hmm.
and that's pretty much my standard working situation. So a lot of the speed bump removal tools that I've been doing are either web-based, because it's like part of the app. It's giving me
Mm.
exactly the debug view I need for this problem. And then I can throw it away when it's done. Or maybe I'll keep it because it proves useful for other problems, right? In this project. Or it's a CLI tool that I can just run across the code base and it finds or fixes or does the thing or automates the step. I was prototyping an idea for a product. I had it just dumping all the data. I just wanted to see if I could collect the right data that made sense to build the product. And it was just dumping the data as a bunch of JSON files. But it was, 300K, 50 files. I had to put it in a directory that was time stamped. I constantly needed to clear out the old ones and also open up the most recent run to see if I got the right data. So I had Claude build me a couple of just recipes that did all the shell magic to keep the last X directories and open all the files in the most recent one. It was 2 minutes with Claude to write those just recipes, put them in my just file, and then that doubled the pace in which I developed for the rest of the day. And I would have never taken the time to build that for a proof of concept, but 2 minutes with Claude Desktop say, make me just recipes that do X and Y. I'm not a shell master where like that's just something I could just and
Mm-hmm.
just shit out in a minute. And so having the LLM do it, like, yeah, that's the sort of thing where like the third time I was like, now which is the most recent directory, and now CD into it, and I'm like, there's got to be a better way, right? And those are the sorts of things that I'm really enjoying. It lets me focus on the fun part of the problem and not the bullshit around it.
Yeah. One other thing is I've been developing projects and kind of working across the portfolio at Infinity that I still haven't come up with a really solid answer to. And you might actually be the best person to answer it that I know, is how does, the work of the things that we're doing in a Django universe in terms of like defining our models, the admin, the overall sort of representation of data intersect with something like Pydantic AI or some of the other agentic tools when we think about both that data representation layer and then also how agents are going to kind of act on it. Like, how do you think about, there are multiple opinionated frameworks that are doing different things and they're kind of glued together? Is that just an API problem, or do you guys, do deeper framework integrations? I'm generating model specs that also spit out Pydantic, or like, how do you sort of think about those two different data representation worlds, those two different kind of opinions of different frameworks and how they operate?
So we're using an API framework called Django Ninja a lot these days, and it's essentially like fast API brought to the Django world. And so you use Pydantic as your serializers. It has a wrapper that automatically maps a model to Pydantic. And so you can say only expose these 7 of 10 fields. The other 3 shouldn't be in the API. So you just list the fields you want or the 3 you want to exclude, and it inflates a Pydantic model for you. So that's not too much of a barrier day to day, that piece of it. And so it's pretty straightforward to go from API to model and back. And then the agents, it's either they're interfacing with an API because you're running the agent remotely and you don't want a tight integration, or your agent has access to the Django ORM and it's just querying the database. And it's the same overall structure. And obviously, that those sorts of decisions mostly depend, in my experience, on org chart more than
Mm-hmm.
technical reasons, right? The reason Amazon and Google have microservices is because they have thousands and thousands of developers with different products that all need to interact, right? I have yet to see a company under 100 people that needs a microservice, right? Like, you need a monolith and maybe one service that's broken out from that needs to scale or behave wildly differently than the rest of the system. And so, like, those sorts of separations, I think, are more driven by org chart than probably technical reasons. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I guess I've been searching for, is there you know, when I think about bootstrapping a Django project and I go and I make my apps and I make my models, I feel like then I also make APIs and then I start working on agents. I've been really searching for, is there something that just sort of end to end generates those connections? But it's probably just that like that is actually a distributed systems problem that I still have to solve as an engineer and think through what are the implications of the way that I think about exposing this, because it's ultimately serializing it the same way that a real API would.
Well, it depends on what your agent's doing, but in most cases, like, why can't your agent just have access to the database,
Yeah,
right?
I
And
guess
you
that's true.
use this, import the model and objects.filter whatever you need, right? And so that's a lot of what we're doing with agents, right? But occasionally you do want your agents to run over here on this hardware and you want to keep some
Yeah.
separation. And so then, yeah, you introduce an API and then it's kind of just a normal REST situation. But I'm sure that there's probably some use for gRPC sorts of things there, at scale and the right team structures and things like that. But, people complicate things early unnecessarily, right? And I'm bad about it. What is it? The premature optimization is the root of all evil. I always joke that I am the devil because I want to do it like I want to do it so early. Like I'm, that proof of concept, like I was telling you about, like I was already like optimizing things for when we had 100,000 customers. And I don't think that there's 100,000 customers on earth for this product, right? Like, I don't know. And I'm like stopping myself going like, why am I worried about Kafka at this point? Like, I don't need Kafka. I need Postgres, right? Like, and, but I have to
Yeah.
stop myself. And so I get how teams and, do it, and you worry about doing it later. How are we going to do it later? It's going to be harder to do later. That's not always harder. It can be, but, you know, um, I like to kind of sketch out that scale plan. I call it a napkin plan. And like, what are we going to do with these various inflection
Hmm.
points so that as we build things, we don't make those things harder, but we don't have to do them right now. Like, okay, I'm going to wrap this in a class or a function so that when we do need to move it to Kafka, I only have to change it right here and not in 83 places, like, which is just good software design. But like, knowing like I have a good solid reason why I want to dry this right here. And it's for that future scalability. Like, I get the fun of gaming out the large uncomplicated system without the slog of actually having to implement it today when we have 3 customers.
That kind of wisdom actually is a great transition to another thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is, I know we've talked that you and your team will do hands-on keyboard development work, but really like with all the experience and all the opportunities you've had to see multiple different teams, that a lot of the work that you do now is almost akin to management consultant or a
Yeah,
strategy consultant. Maybe I'm searching for words here. I mean, help me out. Like how
yeah.
would
No,
you
well,
sort
this
of?
is this is the actually this is the problem I've been having is like I don't know what to call this service, right? And so like Frank fixes your team. I don't, like am
It's
I
got a
a
ring to
software
it.
development am I a software development psychologist? Am I a dev team coach? I don't know what you really call it, but it's multifaceted, right? Sometimes it's meetings, sometimes it's a bad boss, sometimes it's a bad tech lead, sometimes it's a bunch of bad tech decisions. Often the tech team knows what should be done, they're just not allowed to do it. And so sometimes it's selling the right answer upstream, right? And explaining why, hey, they're not just complaining about this because they want to use the new whiz bang library. They're complaining about this because using the current library is super slow and painful and saps their will to live and is no longer supported and maintained. It has these security bugs and you should have gotten rid of it 3 years ago, right? But like convincing the CEO or CTO or whoever needs to be convinced to invest the time to fix that. And so, yeah, it's sometimes you don't have good tests or you have your tests take 3 hours to run. Your deployment process is brittle and you spend all week fighting fires related to your deployment instead of spending a week solidifying your deployment. And it's like where do you want to spend the time? And it's hard sometimes to convince people, but and then especially internally, because Bob's always been complaining about that thing and that's just what Bob does, and Bob's right, but everybody stopped hearing him because it's just his weekly refrain of complaining about the whatever database or this data structure or whatever. And having that, it's sad, but having that outsider come in with the consultant title and say the exact same thing, they go, oh, well, I guess that must be really be what you need to do. And it's like, yeah, like if you just listen to your team. And sometimes the last part of my engagement is telling the boss, hey, these are the 2 people you should be listening to. These guys know what they're doing. Wait, their take 25% more than everybody else on the team, even if maybe they're not the lead dev, right? Because it's like they have the right outlook on how this should work, right? But yeah,
Well,
I don't know what to call it. If anybody has a great idea for a name, I would love it.
Well, I can attest. I mean, I know you came in and really helped my team at Invisible, which I'm very appreciative of. So I think you were able. Hopefully, I was not the boss that had no insight, but I mean, still definitely needed help as you think about scaling up an organization and kind of getting to the bottom of what are both very complex technical issues, but also very complex organizational issues.
Well, and it's a different role in that techies do tech stuff, and kind of your senior leadership is more focused on business problems, and there's often not somebody who's kind of looking at both at the same
Hmm.
time, right? And I think like with your situation, you were spread thin, and you just couldn't be in every meeting to balance the tech decisions and the business decision. And me and some others could come in and like take 2 things off your plate that you didn't have to worry about that we're going to go off the rails. Might not, I might not have made exactly the tech decisions you would have made, but you
But
knew that
we
it wasn't just
kept it in
yeah.
between the bright lines and out of the ditches.
Exactly. And so, and often that's, what some companies need, right? You don't necessarily need three more VPs or something, but like sometimes even just situational, you have a moment of growth or this, the lead has a life situation, they have a baby or something, like having, that kind of a pinch hitter to come in is super useful.
Well, Frank, I could talk to you for hours. Are there other things that you think we should hit?
I know one of the things you want to ask me about is stuff I'm looking at in the future, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, what are you excited about what's coming next?
I'm loving Rust more and more. If Python, isn't at a performance level you need, Rust is where you should be
Hmm.
looking for sure. It is got a learning curve to it, but it is worth it for sure.
What kind of projects are you seeing Rust be really good? I mean, obviously there's like operating system and embedded system kinds of things that's great at, but are there clients, industries, projects that you're seeing it be a great fit for?
Well, I think anything where you would think to reach for C or C++, you should be
Yeah.
reaching for Rust, right? Unless you just happen to, be a huge C or C++ user, in your past life or current life. If you're not strong in those languages, you should just go do Rust. I think it's great for like command line tools. There is a great bridge between Python and Rust these days. So if you have a bit of performance critical code, write most of your platform in Python and have, 20 pages of Rust right there for the absolute performance critical piece. I think that's if anything is going to supplant Python in the next 10 years, it's either JavaScript or Rust. And I would bet it's probably Rust. Right. If anything was going to supplant it, like I think that's the next logical step for people. Nice rigidity, I guess, is the way, like ergonomic rigidity as opposed to shoot yourself in the foot rigidity of other languages.
Yeah, there seems to be, if you can get something to compile in Rust, you can be reasonably sure that it is correct. Or I mean, maybe not the business logic is correct, but at least, I've often thought about is the fact that you can get something that is not strictly defined running in Python, is that a bug or a feature?
It's
Which is
both.
like,
Yeah, it's both.
yeah,
Depends, right? If this is a medical decision software, like,
right.
I think I want Rust. If it's, Instagram, Python's fine, right?
Yeah.
If my picture of my lunch is not, displayed exactly correctly that one time, no one dies.
Yeah,
Not that you
I
can't
think
do serious work in Python, obviously, but
well, certainly, like it would be hard for me to see Rust supplanting Python for rapid prototyping. But I totally, yeah. I mean, I've seen some people say that we should consider C and C++ deprecated, which is a little bit of a spicy take from the Rust community. I don't know, but I definitely think the idea that if we're going to compile something and we can verify the typing is correct and that we're doing borrow checker and all of that kind of, it makes complete sense that we would evolve all of our sort of systems programming into Rust. And that was happening in big tech companies when I was there as well. There was a mass proliferation of those kinds of tools. And so it seems like it's only going to get bigger and better over time.
yeah, I think the other thing is that in this age of LLM generated code, tests and observability become even more important, right? They were always important, but even more so. Like, because you're not spending as much time building stuff, you should have the time to build really, really robust test suites, really great observability and debuggability into your product. And because we're turning over a lot of control to the LLM, and we need, you know, anything we can do to make it less of a black box, right? And I think that's tests and observability in general. The faster I can verify what it's built, does what I want, and quickly look, code review what it's done, and like, okay, none of this looks stupid. Like there's no horrible variable names and things, but
Yeah.
like I'm not reading every line most of the time. I'm verifying the results with tests and behavior. And so I think those tools and how we use them is going to get more and more important.
Yeah, I'm gonna butcher this reference, but I remember a few years ago, actually sort of before LLMs had even become as prevalent in development as they are, MIT decided to stop teaching the structure and interpretation of computer programs. It's still like one of their like January semester classes, but it's not a core part of the curriculum anymore. And their stated reason was that in the early days of computer science, it really was very much a mathematical discipline where you're going through and you're thinking about you're building this system up from first principles. But now a lot of the work that we do, it's built on top of layers upon layers upon layers of things that other people have created. And now the day-to-day work of a computer scientist looks more like a biologist that's coming into a system and trying to observe, when I perturb the system in this way, this is the outcome that I get. And what is the observability of, whenever I make a change, these are the things that are happening. And it's less about this sort of deterministic, I can always understand this is exactly what's going to happen. Like we're not programming gate arrays anymore, and it's less about truth tables and it's more about there's this organic thing that has evolved from the combination of multiple different commercial and open source interests to create a system that now exists. And I got to figure out, is it serving requests in the way that it's supposed to, or is it spending money the way that it's supposed to, or am I getting the end user result that I need? As opposed to a world where I can reliably say this is always going to be deterministic and I'm going to understand it from beginning to end. I'm going to observe what it does, and hopefully I have a prayer of knowing what might come out the other side.
No, that's great. I love that analogy. Yeah, like what happens if I feed it this? What happens if I put it in a petri dish with another agent? What happens? Let's observe, right? Like, no, I think that's great. I do. I think things are moving more and more that direction, and so yeah, we need the electron tunneling microscopes and things to be able to make those observations where before they were maybe the realm of ops and not so much dev. I think that's more and more needs to be part of your local development stack.
Yeah. Well, are there other open source tools or projects, experiments, rabbit holes, things that are kind of that you're going deep on these days, apart from sort of some of the agentic work?
I mean, mostly it's like I said, it's those little bitty for me tools, right? I'm spending time like I use Raycast on a Mac to like launch apps and things. I'm building Raycast plugins with Claude to solve that one thing I need to do for that one client that I need to do once a month. Where 5 years ago, it's like, I'm never going to spend a Saturday doing that, But now I can spend 30 minutes while I'm in a meeting and occasionally replump Claude to fix a thing. And I've got what I need. And that's freeing up time and stress and mental capacity to get more interesting things done on what I'm supposed to be working on. It's not necessarily like a set of tools. I have like, I've been getting some new CLI tools and things that, speed me up a little bit here and there, like Z-Oxide and just some of those, better command line tools that kind of replace some of the original GNU stuff, rip grep instead of grep, FD instead of find, some of those sorts of things that are great, like little 30-second, 1-minute speed ups throughout my day. But no, I'm not like down a big open source rabbit hole of any one particular, there's nothing like Django that I see on the horizon, that's coming up. I do think we're going to end up with more bespoke stuff because we can build more stuff. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be amazing projects like Pydantic and Pydantic AI that we end up leveraging and using. But I don't know that some of the projects that might have happened might be getting blunted in their development simply because the rough edges that used to exist don't bother us anymore because the LLM is dealing with the rough edges. That motivation to go build the web framework you wanted isn't there as much if you're not running into that rough edge that you don't like and you wanted to smooth out. The LLM's doing that. You built a little tool on top of something like Django or Fast API that smooths out, the thing that you didn't like. And so you just keep using those underlying tools. So I don't know. There actually might be some less big popular open source projects and maybe more less popular, less used, but still awesome, smaller projects that people kind of stitch together.
Yeah. Well, Frank, this has been super fun. I feel like every time I talk to you, I learn something new, and I always realize that we should talk more regularly. If folks want to find you, what's a great way to get in touch with you? Website, LinkedIn, email. Like, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
If you go to frankwiles.com, it's got all of my social media stuff on there, ways to contact me, and then for work stuff, RevSys.com. Those are the best places to find me.
Well, Frank, thank you for taking the time. Like I said, this was a great conversation, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks. I had a great time, and hopefully we can chat again soon.
Thanks, man. Thank you for listening to the Open Story podcast. Each week we share interviews with technology leaders, founders, and visionaries to discuss their stories and what they're most excited about. If you're interested in being interviewed, please reach out to us on our website, openstorypodcast.com. For the latest episodes, you can subscribe in your favorite podcast app or visit the website, once again, at openstorypodcast.com.